Welcome back to Naked History, the show where we rip the fig leaf off the past and discover that sometimes the good old days were just OSHA violations wearing a nice hat. I'm Dylan, and today's episode is about beauty, science, money, corporate denial, labor rights, and radioactive jawbones, and the uniquely American business model of saying we've investigated ourselves and found that your teeth are the problem. Today, we're going to be covering the story of the Radium Girls. And I need you to picture something before we begin. Picture a factory floor, early 20th century, rows of young women seated at long tables. Their heads bent over, tiny watch faces, tiny instrument dials, and tiny numbers that must be painted with perfect precision. The work is delicate and repetitive, almost artistic, and around them, dust floats through the air like glitter. And the glitter glows. It gets in your hair, it gets in dresses under the fingernails, and when they leave work, they shine. Literally. They'll walk home through dark streets with their clothes shimmering faintly, like they've stolen moonlight and tucked it into their sleeves. And that sounds magical, which is rude because it's not. It's radium. And radium, unfortunately, doesn't care if you look adorable on your walk home. The women painting those dials were told that the material was safe. They were told that it was harmless, and they were told to sharpen their brushes with their lips. Dip, lip, paint, dip, lip, paint. A little radioactive paint in the mouth over and over and over because the company wanted crisp numbers and fast production. And when the women started losing teeth, breaking bones, developing tumors, collapsing from the pain, and dying in ways so grotesque that even the medical establishment had to stop pretending that this was normal, the companies did what companies so often do when confronted with human suffering caused by profit. They deny it and they delay it. They blame the workers, they hire experts, they bury the reports, and they played for time. Because time for the Radium Girls was exactly what was running out. And yet, here's the part that matters. These women did not simply become victims in a tragic industrial footnote. They fought. From sickbeds, from courtrooms, from bodies that were quite literally disintegrating because capitalism handed them poison and called it opportunity. They forced America to look at what the glowing mess it had made. So today, we're talking about the Radium Girls, or corporate denial with a glow. And yes, by the end of this episode, you'll probably be emotionally attached to several dead watch painters and furious at approximately every man in a suit, which, for this podcast, is usually a Tuesday. So let's get naked. At the turn of the 20th century, radium was not yet the villain in the story. Radium was the miracle. It had been discovered in 1898 by Marie and Pierre Curie, and the world lost its entire little mind. Here was an element that glowed, it gave off energy, and it seemed alive. It seemed futuristic. It seemed like science had reached into a fairy tale and pulled out a substance that could shimmer in the dark without flame, without electricity, and without explanation that the average person could understand. And when the average person cannot understand a scientific phenomenon, the market appears, wearing tap shoes. Now, radium was in health tonics, it was in cosmetics, it was in toothpaste, it was in face creams, it was in products marketed with that thrilling early modern combination of science and absolutely no regulation. People drank radioactive water as a health treatment because apparently every era is legally required to have at least one wellness trend that makes future historians clutch their heads and whisper, "Why were you doing this?" Now, radium was marketed as energy, as vitality, youth, the glow of the future. And to be fair, people did not yet understand radiation the way that we do now. This is new science at the time. The danger was not obvious to everyone at first, but that sentence does have a little trapdoor under it, because not everyone understood the danger immediately is different from no one had warning signs and therefore nobody was responsible. Scientists and factory owners were not equally ignorant. Some people wore gloves, some people used tongs, and some people handled radium with care. And some people told teenage girls to put it in their mouths. And that's the difference in the story. Radium's glow made it incredibly useful for luminous paint. If you mix radium with zinc sulfide, you could create a paint that glowed in the dark, And in a world increasingly full of wristwatches, clocks, military instruments, aircraft gauges, and navigation equipment, glow in the dark numbers were not just cute, they were valuable, especially during the First World War. Soldiers needed to read watches and instrument panels in the dark, pilots needed dials, and the military needed equipment that could be seen without lighting a match and announcing, "Hello, enemy, I am over here." So radium dial painting became the big business, and the work was often done by young women. And why women? Well, because the job required steady hands, patience, precision, and the ability to do painstakingly repetitive work for low wages while being told that it was a privilege. So, the traditional hiring package. The factories recruited girls and young women, many of them teenagers or in their early 20s. This was considered good work at the time. It was clean work, it was skilled work, and it was patriotic work. Compared to the other industrial jobs, dial painting could be seen as almost glamorous. The pay was much better than the options that were available to working class women, and the material was fascinating, and then the finished product was modern and important. And the women themselves became a part of the glow. They were sometimes called ghost girls because they shimmered after work. Their clothes glowed, their skin glowed. Some reportedly painted the material on their nails or teeth for fun because, again, they had been told it was safe. If your workplace tells you that something is harmless and everyone around you treats it like fairy dust, you're not being reckless, you're just being lied to in a room with payroll. The central technique used by them was called lip pointing. The brushes used for painting numbers were so tiny to make a fine point, the women were taught to put the brush between their lips, shape it with their mouth, and then dip it back into the paint and continue. So you had dip to lip to paint, dip to lip to paint. And that rhythm is important because it's not a one-time exposure. This was not one dramatic accident where a barrel exploded and everybody immediately understood the danger. This was ordinary. It was quiet, built into the workday, a poison that entered through routine. A little bit each time, a little more tomorrow, a little more next week. A little more until the body became a ledger, recording every lie that the company had told. One of the best-known factories was in Orange, New Jersey, run by the United States Radium Corporation. Before that, the company had been connected to the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation, and because early 20th century corporate naming conventions were apparently designed to sound like a villain's shell company in a Batman comic, we'll mostly just call it US Radium here. Now, US Radium marketed a paint under the name Undark. Now, Undark is an incredible name, horrifying in retrospect, but from a branding perspective, annoyingly good. It sounds like a haunted flashlight. It sounds like a nightclub for ghosts. It sounds like a product that you'd buy from a man in a cape who promises that it has no side effects except destiny. Now, Undark made watch faces glow, and it made workers sick. One of those workers was Amelia Maggia, often called Molly. Molly worked at the orange plant. She was young, lively, and part of a community of women who knew one another, worked together, and joked together, and went home covered in the strange sparkle of the job. Then, one day, her teeth began to hurt. And at first, that sounds ordinary. Dental problems are not rare. Especially in the early 20th century, dentistry was not exactly a spa day. A toothache could happen to anybody. So a tooth came out, and then another. And then the wounds didn't heal. Her mouth became ulcerated, her jaw deteriorated, and infection spread, and the pain intensified. Her body was trying to explain the plot, and nobody wanted to read the subtitles. Doctors were confused. They diagnosed her with various conditions, and at one point, like many women in this story, suspicion and shame were used as weapons. Some radium workers were accused or implied to have venereal disease, especially syphilis, because nothing says we value women's labor like poisoning them and trying to ruin their reputations on the way out. Molly Maggia died in 1922. Her death certificate did not initially tell the full truth. The official explanation missed the industrial poisoning at the center of it all, but Molly's body knew. Her co-workers knew something was wrong, and one sick woman might be a tragedy, two might be a coincidence, but when the pattern spreads across a workforce, coincidence starts looking like an awful lot, like a cover-up in a tailored coat. And so the pattern spread. Women who had painted dials began experiencing terrible symptoms: tooth loss, jaw necrosis, anemia, bone fracture, pain, tumors, bodies breaking from within. This is where radium becomes especially cruel, because radium behaves chemically somewhat like calcium. The body can deposit it in the bones, so when these women ingested radium, they did not simply pass through politely like a bad dinner decision, it lodged in them. It settled into the bone and it irradiated tissue from the inside. The glow was not on them, it was in them. And that's the horror of this story. Not just that the substance was dangerous, not just that the companies denied it, but that the injury became intimate. Internal, the workplace followed them home inside their skeletons. Now, there are stories from this case that sound almost too gothic to be real. Jawbones literally crumbling, bones honeycombed with damage, women who could no longer walk, women whose bodies emitted radiation that could be measured, graves that contained contamination and remain there to this day. The dead still testifying because the living tried so hard not to listen. And while the workers suffered, the company insisted that there was no problem. Because, of course, the corporate response was not, oh no, we may have endangered our workers, stop production and investigate honestly, provide the medical care. No, that would require a functioning conscience, and apparently those are not in a lot of budgets. Instead, US Radium and the related industry actors leaned into denial. They questioned causation, they disputed findings, and they suggested other explanations. They delayed legal action and they protected the brand. And this is where the story becomes a little bit bigger than the radium because corporate denial has a very specific smell. It smells like memos, it smells like lawyers, it smells like someone saying there is no conclusive evidence while standing knee-deep in said conclusive evidence. It smells like a boardroom deciding that admitting fault would be expensive, so maybe the dying woman can just be made to feel confused, ashamed, or too exhausted to fight. And that's the playbook. It's not always with radium, sometimes it's with asbestos or tobacco, sometimes chemicals in the water or dust in the lungs, or maybe even toxins in the soil. The product changes, but the sentence structure does not. We don't know. The science is uncertain. More research is needed. The workers were careless. This was an isolated incident. We care deeply. Translation, please die quietly before discovery. But the Radium Girls did not die quietly. Grace Fryer is one of the central figures in the New Jersey fight. Grace began working at US Radium as a young woman during World War I. Like so many others, she was part of the dial painting workforce, and eventually she left the job, but the job did not leave her. Her health began to fail and her teeth loosened. Her jaw deteriorated, her body weakened. Doctors struggled to understand what was happening or struggled to say it plainly, and when Grace began seeking legal help, she found that justice, much like radium, had a half-life. She had trouble finding an attorney. Think about that. A woman is being physically destroyed by a workplace poison, and it takes her years to find someone willing to take the case. Not because the suffering is invisible and not because the facts are morally complicated, but because the company is powerful. The science is specialized, and the women are poor and sick. The legal system loves evidence, but has historically been suspiciously bad at hearing people before their bodies become exhibits. Eventually, attorney Raymond Berry agreed to represent Grace and the other women. The group included Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and sisters Quinta McDonald and Albina Larice. They sued US Radium. But by then, the press had begun calling them the Radium Girls. Now, the name was catchy, but it was also a little uncomfortable, because girls captures their youth in the way that the public saw them, but it can also make them sound fragile, decorative, and mostly mythic. These were workers, women, people with families, personalities, jokes, crushes, bills, ambitions, bad days, good shoes, favorite foods, annoying relatives, and plans for lives much longer than the ones they were allowed to have. But Radium Girls stuck. And maybe that's because the name itself contains the contradiction. Radium. It's modern, scientific, industrial, powerful, and girls. Young, underprotected, and underestimated. The case became a spectacle. The women, however, during it were very ill. Some were so physically fragile that the company's delayed looked not just strategic, but monstrous. If you're defending a corporation and your best legal hope is maybe the plaintiffs die before trial, Congratulations, you're not the good guy. You are a haunted filing cabinet. Now, U.S. Radium eventually settled the case in 1928. The settlement gave the women money, medical expenses, and annuities. It mattered, and it was not nothing, but the company did not admit liability. Now, please pause and admire the choreography here, because the company pays settlement money to dying workers allegedly harmed by the company's product and process, while still essentially saying, "This means nothing, we are innocent, please enjoy your compensation," flavored coincidence. It is corporate denial with a glow. But the settlement did something else too. It made the danger public. It turned the Radium Girls into a national story, and it showed other workers that mysterious illnesses were not personal failures. It pushed occupational disease into the public conversation, and it made one thing harder for the industry: pretending nobody knew. But still, the danger did not vanish after New Jersey. Because history is not a straight line towards wisdom. It's more like a Roomba with a knife taped to it. It bumps in the same wall several times and somehow still acts surprised. In Ottawa, Illinois, another group of women worked for the Radium Dial Company. It's a different location, but the same glow, same kind of work, and the same deadly brush. Now, Radium Dial had its own dial painters, its own production demands, its own assurances, and the women in Ottawa were also exposed. They also got sick, and by the 1930s, the pattern that had already emerged in New Jersey was happening again. One of the central figures here was Catherine Wolfe Donahue. Catherine had began working at Radium Dial as a young woman. She was not reckless, she was not foolish, she was just doing a job that paid, and a job that seemed respectful, a job that women were told was safe. Years later, Catherine was gravely ill. Her body wasted, her bones weakened. She suffered terribly, and yet became one of the women who pressed the Illinois case forward. There is a photograph often associated with this phase of the story: Catherine Donahue, sick and frail, surrounded by other women involved in the fight. It's one of those images that makes you feel quiet until you understand what you're looking at. Then it becomes a thunder. Catherine testified from her sickbed. And that sentence deserves more than a pass. She testified from her sickbed because her body was too damaged for the normal rituals of justice. The courtroom had to come to her because the poison had already taken so much. Imagine being that ill and still having to prove that your suffering counts. Imagine your bones breaking, your body's failing, and across from you is not just disease but paperwork. Appeals, denials, men arguing whether the thing that entered your body at work was truly responsible for the destruction of your body. It's hard to not feel rage here, and I don't think that we should brush past that rage. Now, some historical stories invite distance. This one doesn't. This one puts its hand on your shoulder with a glowing skeleton and says, "No, stay mad." Catherine Donahue and the Ottawa women won before the Illinois Industrial Commission in 1938. Radium Dial appealed, and Catherine lived long enough to know of a major victory, but she died in early July of that year before the appeals were finally finished. Let that sit for a second. She fought long enough to win, but did not live long enough to enjoy the world her fight helped change. And that's the shape of so many labor victories. The people who force the door open are often too wounded to walk through it. And the company, well, they appealed. Because apparently even when a dying woman has testified from her bed, there is still someone in a suit willing to say, "Have we considered being worse?" Now, the Ottawa case helped strengthen the legal recognition of occupational disease. It mattered for workers' compensation, and it mattered for employer responsibility. It mattered for the idea that the workplace could poison you slowly and still be held accountable. Now, that might be obvious to us now, but it was not obvious enough then. And frankly, it's not always obvious enough now either. Because one of the ugliest parts of the Radium Girls story is how familiar it feels. Now, the details are period specific: the bobbed hair, the watch dials, the factory benches, the luminous plant, the almost comic book optimism around radium. But the structure, well, it's painfully current. Workers raise concerns. Companies minimize them. Experts are hired and reports are questions. Illness is individualized and regulators lag behind. And the public, well, they learn too late. And then years later, someone says, well, that was a different time. Was it? Because Radium Girls are not just a story about ignorance. They're a story about knowledge unevenly distributed. They're a story about whose bodies are allowed to absorb risk so that other people can absorb profit. The scientists and executives did not all behave the same way as the dial painters. Some in the industry knew enough to protect themselves. Men working with radium in laboratories often used shields, tongs, masks, or other precautions. Meanwhile, the women doing the repetitive production work were told to put brushes in their mouths. That contrast is the moral center of this episode. If radium was safe enough for the girls' mouths, why were others careful with it? And that is the question that glows brighter than the paint. And the answer is not flattering. The dial painters were treated as replaceable. Their youth made them exploitable. Their gender, especially at this time, made them easier to dismiss. Their class made them easier to pressure, and their illnesses could be reframed as personal weakness, sexual shame, bad luck, or a medical mystery. Because the damage took time to appear, the company could hide behind delay. Slow violence is convenient only for the powerful. If a machine cuts off a worker's hand, the injury is immediate. It's visible, it's hard to explain away, though heaven knows someone will try. But if a substance enters the body slowly, if symptoms emerge years later, if causation requires expertise, the denial has a room to stretch its legs. And that's what happened here. Radium poisoning blurred the line between workplace and home, between accident and illness, between science and law, and the women had to prove not only that they were sick, but that their sickness had a source, and they had to turn their bodies into evidence. Harrison Martland, a pathologist in New Jersey, became important because he helped prove that radium was poisoning the dial painters. Scientific testing could detect radioactivity in their body. Exhumations and examinations revealed the truth that the companies had resisted. The women were not imagining it. They were not immoral. They were not unlucky. They had been poisoned. And here is where the dead become witness. And that phrase sounds dramatic, but it's accurate. The bodies of former dial painters helped reveal the nature of the poisoning. Their remains could still register radiation. Radium's long half-life meant that even death did not erase the evidence. And the companies wanted silence, but the bones, they kept talking. There's something almost mythological about that, like the murdered in an old folk tale whose blood cries out from the ground. Except this isn't folklore, this is industrial America. The ghost isn't supernatural, it's measurable. A Geiger counter is just a haunted house's detector with better paperwork. Now, the Radium Girls changed public understanding of radiation. Before them, radium had been marketed as vitality. After them, the glow looked different. It looked dangerous. It looked like a warning. Now, that didn't mean that radium vanished overnight. Radium dials continued to be produced for decades, though safety practices did improve, but the fantasy of a harmless glow had been completely cracked open. And once the public saw what happened to the dial painters, it became harder and harder to sell radium as bottled sunshine. Not impossible. Now, let's not overestimate humanity. We have, as a species, repeatedly proven that given enough marketing, we will lick the forbidden spoon. But harder. Now, the Radium Girls also helped reshape workplace safety law. Their cases contributed to broader recognition that the employees could be responsible for occupational disease, not just sudden workplace injuries. They also helped push forward reforms around industrial hazards, worker compensation, and safety standards. Now, some people summarize that as this, that the Radium Girls died so OSHA could exist. Now, that is emotionally satisfying, but it's very simple. Way too simple. OSHA, the American Occupational Safety and Health Administration, wasn't created until the 1970s, so a couple decades later. The Radium Girls did not directly create OSHA like a glowing fairy godmother waving a radioactive wand over Congress, but their case did help build the legal, medical, and cultural foundation for modern workplace safety. They became a part of a long, brutal argument. The workers have a right to survive their jobs. And what a sentence that is. Workers have the right to survive their jobs. You would think that would be like one of the first rules. Like before clock in on time and don't steal office pins, we maybe establish your jaw should remain attached while doing the job. But history is often the story of obvious moral principles arriving late, badly dressed, and only after people suffered enough to make denial embarrassing. And the Radium Girls are remembered because they made denial embarrassing. They made it public, they made it costly, and they made it visible. And that's the irony, isn't it? The companies wanted the glow. They wanted their products to shine in the dark. They wanted consumers to marvel at luminous numbers on watches and clocks. But the real glow became evidence. The glow that followed the women home. The glow that entered their bones, and the glow that exposed the lie. Now let's talk a moment about the word safe. Because in this story, safe does a lot of dirty work. The dial painters were told that the paint was safe. The companies insisted the work was safe. But safe for whom? Safe for the consumer who wore the watch? Maybe in a limited sense, where looking at the dial was not the same as ingesting the paint all day. Safe for executives? Certainly safer because they were not the ones lip-pointing brushes for hours. Safe for the scientists taking precautions? Safer. Safe for the young women swallowing tiny amounts of radium because speed and precision mattered more than their internal organs? No. Safe is often used as if it is universal. But safety has geography. It has class, it has gender, it has a payroll number, and it depends on where you stand in the factory and whether the danger is placed in your hand, your lungs, your mouth, or your bloodstream. A product can be safe for the person buying it and deadly for the person making it. It's one of the great moral scams of consumer culture. The clean shelf hides the dirty floor. The glowing watch face hides the glowing worker. And the Radium Girls force us to look behind the product. Because this was not just a tragedy of science moving too fast, it was a tragedy of business deciding that uncertainty was useful. It was a tragedy of institutions trusting companies more than workers, and it was a tragedy of women's pain being treated as exaggeration until it could be measured with instruments men respected. The part is evergreen and infuriating. The women knew that something was wrong. Their bodies knew, their co-workers knew, and their families knew, but knowledge from suffering had to fight knowledge from authority. And authority had nicer stationery. And that's why stories like this matter. Not because they make us feel superior to the past. We should be very, very careful of that. It's very easy to look at radium toothpaste and say, oh, how silly, how primitive, how could they not know? While we live in a world full of microplastics, forever chemicals, algorithmic brain melting, and office chairs designed to be medieval interrogators. The point is not that we are smarter, the point is that systems repeat. The Radium Girls teach us to ask better questions. Who says that it's safe? Who benefits if we believe them? Who is exposed and who is protected? And who is being told to wait for more evidence while their body becomes the evidence? And who gets dismissed because their pain is inconvenient? By the late 1920s and 1930s, the Radium Girls had become a symbol. Newspapers covered them, reformers used their cases to argue for stronger worker protections, and medical understanding of radiation advanced partly because their suffering forced the issue. But we should resist turning them into symbols too quickly. Grace Fryer was not born to be a symbol. Catherine Donahue was not born to be a lesson. And Molly Maggia did not owe the future of her jawbone. These are women who wanted ordinary lives. Jobs, paychecks, families, independence, maybe a little fun, maybe a little glamour. Maybe the satisfaction of doing skilled work in a modern industry during a moment when the world seemed to be glowing toward the future. Instead, they were made into warnings. And there is a kind of historical cruelty in celebrating what people accomplished only because they were harmed. Yes, the Radium Girls changed workplace safety, and yes, their fight mattered. Yes, their courage helped protect others, but they should not have had to be that brave. They should have been bored at work. They should have complained about supervisors, saved money, gone dancing, gotten older, changed jobs, had bad haircuts, made questionable romantic decisions, became aunties, mothers, neighbors, weird old ladies with opinions about soup. They should have had the luxury of being ordinary, and that was stolen. Not just health and not just wages, not just legal rights, ordinary time. The company stole years and then tried to steal the meaning of those years by denying responsibility. but the women took the meaning back. Grace Fryer and the New Jersey plaintiffs forced U.S. radium into the public eye. Catherine Donahue and the Ottawa women pushed the fight toward Illinois. Others in Waterbury and elsewhere added to the long record of injury and resistance. Their names are not equally remembered, which is his own injustice, but the collective story remains. They were not passive, and they were not merely tragic. They were workers who organized, testified, sued, spoke, endured, and made their suffering legible to a country that preferred its glowing watches without glowing consequences. And there is one final layer of bitter irony. The radium was once marketed as life, as energy, health, rejuvenation, a miracle from the earth. For the dial painters, it became the opposite. But because they fought, because scientists eventually documented the truth, because reformers amplified it, and because reporters covered it, because families preserved it, and because the women refused to vanish quietly, their story did become a source of life for others. Not in the fake tonic way, but in the hard-won human way. Their deaths helped prevent other deaths. Their lawsuits helped build stronger protections. Their suffering helped reveal invisible danger. Their glow became a warning light. And that doesn't redeem what happened, let's be clear. History does not need every tragedy wrapped in a bow like a cursed birthday present. Some things remain awful even when good comes from them. But it does mean that the companies failed at their final task. They could delay, they could deny, and they could smear. They could settle without admitting fault, and they could appeal until the plaintiff was dead. They could not make the Radium Girls disappeared. Because the thing about glow is that it draws the eye. And a century later, we're still looking. So the next time someone tells you a workplace hazard is fine, harmless, perfectly safe, nothing to worry about, and by the way, productivity is up 15% if everyone just stops complaining, remember the dial painters. Remember the brush, remember the rhythm. Dip, lip, paint. Remember the women walking home through the dark shining. Remember that the glow was never magic. It was evidence. And remember that the past does not whisper. Sometimes it glows in the dark and says, believe the workers before their bones have to testify. And I've been Dylan Gassaway, and this has been Naked History. If you like this episode, follow the show, leave a review, and tell your friend who enjoys history with a side of corporate crimes and emotional damage. And if your workplace ever hands you something radioactive and calls it teen culture, please unionize immediately. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never trust a miracle product that sounds like it was named by a haunted chemist. So until the debrief, remember, always stay naked. Historically speaking, of course. Have a good one.